There we go. Okay, so welcome everyone. It is so great to have all of you join us today. We have an awesome guest with us. We're very lucky. So I'm going to introduce Wabagijik Rice, who is an author, was a journalist, and he may talk about that a little bit later if we have time, from Musauksing First Nation. And I'm going to inform you, because you may not know, because I know many folks are reading Moon of the Crested Snow right now, but he actually has a couple other things that he's released before that. So his first short story collection was Midnight Sweat Lodge, and his debut novel was actually Legacy, which came out in 2014, which was a few years before Moon of the Crested Snow, which was released in October of 2018. Wab is actually a graduate from Ryerson University, and we may have some conversations around that later this afternoon as well. And he is here with us. He is now living in Sudbury, so we're very lucky that he's around. With his wife Sarah and his two boys. So we are so happy to have Wabagijik Rice here with us. So I will turn it over to you. Welcome, and again.
Okay, miigwech, Jeanette. Ani bojo kinawaya menon akweg Wabagijik Indigenous makwano dem Musauksing non jaba Nishnabe minwa jagina shinda. Hi, happy noon, everybody. My name is Wabagijik Rice. I'm a member of the Bear Clan of the Anishinaabe of Musauksing First Nation. That's an island community on Georgian Bay near Parry Sound, Ontario. I'm of Anishinaabe and Canadian descent. And you may feel free to call me Wab for short if you like. As Jeanette mentioned, I'm here at home in Sudbury, where I live with my wife and our two little boys. And where I grew up and where we reside now is all lands that are under the Robinson-Huron Treaty, signed in 1850, which is, of course, a treaty that predates Canadian Confederation. And I'm very pleased and honored to call Swakamak, also known as Sudbury, the traditional territory of Atikamekw and Anishinaabe home. We've lived here for almost 5 years now, and we don't have any plans on going anywhere else. We feel like we found a good home here. We're very happy to raise our two sons here. And most importantly, we're close to our home communities, both me and my wife. So it's just a real pleasure to be a community member. And it's a great honor to be invited to share a bit of my story and my experiences with you all. I always say, and I mean this, wholeheartedly, that the greatest honor for me as an author is to have my books read and studied in the classroom. Because for me, that's, I guess, dream of becoming an author began when I was your age, when I was a teenager. So now at 42 years old, to be able to share how I became an author and what some of my stories are with you all, it's kind of like full circle, right? And it's just really neat to have this opportunity, because I could have never imagined having a book published and then having it read in schools. So again, it's the coolest thing. And I thank you all for taking the time to read my story. And I know that some of you are just starting it, some of you are partway through or maybe done. So I'll do my best not to spoil anything for you when I'm talking about the story itself. But I just want you to know, when we do open it up for questions in about 15 minutes or so, you can ask me anything about the book or my earlier books, the writing process, my career as a journalist. I won't talk too much about that now, but if you're interested in that later, I'll be happy to answer your questions. I worked for almost 20 years as a journalist, mostly with CBC, also here in Sudbury. And yeah, if you want to ask me about what it was like to grow up on the res and then move to the city. I went from the res to Toronto, which is a big change when I was 19 years old. But I also have other interesting experiences too. I was an exchange student to Germany when I was 17 years old. And that's really what got me on the path to journalism. So that's another story I can tell if you're interested in hearing about that a little bit later. But right now, I'm going to focus on my career path as an author, how my upbringing really shaped that, and some of the lessons and insights I've gained along the way that may be helpful to you. Some of you may be interested in writing or becoming an author, but also there are other skills that come along with that, like public speaking, communications, digital technology, all these cool things I've picked up along the way. So if there's anything you're wondering about, anything like that, just feel free to ask me when the time comes. So just to give you a little background on myself, I grew up in my home community. And when I was a kid in the early 80s, it was a really important time in our First Nation, because the grown-ups and the elders were making pretty serious efforts to reconnect with our culture and our Anishinaabe heritage and stories. And this was after some pretty dark times in our community. Just to give you a bit of historical context, the ancestors that I'm descended from, the Anishinaabe of the North Shore of Georgian Bay, Lake Huron, were removed from the mainland where Parry Sound now is, and forced out onto an island, which is also known as Parry Island, but it's been known as Wasaksing by our people for a really long time. So when Canada was confederated in 1867, and the Department of Indian Affairs was enshrined into law, and the Indian Act became law eventually as well, how the Robinson-Huron Treaty was interpreted was to put the Anishinaabe that we eventually became out onto this island, to remove them from that mainland, because forestry became the primary industry in the Parry Sound, Ontario area. And one can surmise that the government and the corporations that wanted to log saw the Indigenous people there as an obstacle, so they removed them and put them out onto this island. Then other laws were put into place. The Indian Act forbade people from leaving the community, the island, without permission from the Indian agent. Cultural practices were forbidden, gatherings were forbidden, residential schools came into effect, and that's when the children started being taken away. And then over the decades, there was just a succession of really traumatic things that happened to our people, and that resulted in a lot of death and a lot of tragic circumstances. So by the time my generation came along, our community had enough of that, had enough of people dying, of really violent things happening. And they wanted to reverse that cycle of abuse that was imposed upon them by the government of Canada. So they decided that they would turn to our culture to try to raise us in a positive way. And I feel so lucky that that was right when my life began, was when our community began to turn things around, because I benefited from that in so many ways. We started having cultural celebrations in our community again, like an annual powwow in the summer. Ceremonies started happening again, like sweat lodge and fasting ceremonies and the like. And those things were illegal for a long time under the Indian Act, right? But that's what brought a new life into our community. The most important thing I believe that happened at that time was our community taking control of our education. So for many, many decades, there was a day school right in the reserve, and it was called Ryerson Indian Day School. So if you're unfamiliar with the day school, basically it was like a complement to a residential school. So at a residential school, the children were taken from their families and housed there and lived there for most of the year. But at a day school, the kids could go home to their families at night. But the whole purpose of the day school was the same as residential schools, which was to erase culture and to violently remove identity from people. And kids like my dad were punished for speaking their language, for doing anything related to Anishinaabe culture, and so on. Fortunately, I believe in the early 1970s, the federal government relinquished control of that school to our First Nation. And it remained a day school in name only, but it was operational as a kindergarten. So kids from the community would go there for junior and senior kindergarten, and then they'd go into Parry Sound for the rest of their schooling, for elementary and high school. But in the early to mid 80s, when I started there, and my peers who were my age our band and our parents and elders and everybody else lobbied the federal government to expand the school up to grade 8. And they were successful in doing that. They received funding to make sure that we could graduate from our school on the reserve in grade 8. And I was amongst the first cohort that was a part of that. So this sort of historic measure. A big part of that was infusing Anishinaabe culture into the curriculum and into the learning process. So of course, our school abided by the Ontario curriculum, with language arts and math and science and so on. But there was also some integral cultural learning that our teachers put into our schedules. And that included visits from elders to come and share stories with us, or to take us out into the bush to gather medicine or go to sacred sites. And also other sort of cultural learning, like weaving baskets, tying moccasins, learning to tie snares, and so on, right? And for me, that was very formative as a child, to have that Anishinaabe learning baked into the school day. It was huge for me. And what I really gravitated towards the most was the storytelling component that was equipped to enable us with that awareness of who we were as Anishinaabe. So when those elders came in and told us stories like the Nanabush story, like the trickster stories, or other creation stories, community history, family history, language lessons, whatever else. Every time we had that oral storytelling with an elder, that really left a big impression on me. And I understood just how crucial storytelling was to our people in the face of all these violent measures that were supposed to eliminate our culture. And I decided at a very early age that it was incumbent upon me, it was my responsibility as an Anishinaabe person to remember these stories and to keep telling them to the next generations, because that's what had happened since time immemorial before us. And that was why I had that keen understanding of who I was as an Anishinaabe as a kid. It was really cool. So I held on to that. And then by the time grade 9 rolled around, I went to school off reserve. And I saw a different way to approach storytelling. I loved books when I was younger, and I really enjoyed reading. But when I got to high school, I saw that storytelling, that became the sort of foundation or the focal point of storytelling, right? It wasn't so much the oral component. It was sitting by yourself and reading a book, which is, when you think about it, a really solitary and isolating practice, because, you're left on your own. It's very quiet. Sometimes you'll have discussions with the people around you about the book you're reading, but that's only on special occasions, right? Like, outlined by your teacher and so on, right? Nonetheless, I really loved it. I really enjoyed literature. I loved allowing my imagination to form images from the words I was reading. I had visceral reactions to some of the emotions I felt reading some of these books. And it was really encouraging for me to just sort of immerse myself in that way of storytelling. However, it was entirely separate from what I understood as storytelling as an Anishinaabe kid. And because at that age, at that time in the 1990s, when I was in high school, there was no representation of Indigenous people in literature whatsoever, in the Ontario curriculum. Fortunately, you all today have a whole course that's dedicated to Indigenous literature, which is so awesome, That is so something I would have appreciated or needed when I was your age, right? But fortunately, I learned about Indigenous literature, and I'll mention that in a moment. So I was going through grade 9, grade 10, 11, just, reading and enjoying the books, enjoying the creative writing assignments, but just feeling a little bit detached from that world because I didn't see myself in it whatsoever. And I just thought, okay, the stories I learned as a kid had no place in books because I just hadn't seen that, that didn't exist in my sort of universe, even though there were people out there doing really important things to document Indigenous experiences in literature. So one of my aunts, who was one of my first teachers in the school on the reserve, she was always really keen to learn about my educational journey. And she always asked me whenever we hung out how school was going. And we were at a family function. I think I was probably in grade 11 when this happened, but she sat beside me and we started talking about school. And she said, "Yeah, what's your favorite class?" And I said, "Oh, it's English." And she said, "Oh yeah, why is that?" And I said, "Well, I like reading books and I like the creative writing. It's really fun, and it's my best subject. I get my best marks in English." And she said, "Oh yeah, who are you reading? What authors?" And I was like, "Oh, Shakespeare and W.O. Mitchell and J.D. Salinger and Sir William Golding and so on." And it was this long list of old white dudes, right? And she just kind of went, "Oh yeah," and didn't really say anything after that. And that was just the end of that conversation. That's how we interacted, right? My aunt and I. But in the years that followed, for my birthday and for Christmas, she would give me books by Indigenous authors, people who I didn't know existed, and books that I didn't know were out there for me to read and learn from. So people like Richard Wagamese, Lee Maracle, Louise Erdrich, Thomas King, Richard Van Camp, these people who were doing groundbreaking work at a time when I really needed it. But again, wasn't exposed to it all through the formal education system because authors of color weren't represented in the curriculum back in the 1990s, right? So that totally changed my life. It opened my eyes. It blew my mind to see familiar experiences written about and printed and bound in a book. And it empowered me to do more of that. And I took it upon myself to formalize writing as one of my hobbies, as one of my passions. So I would go home from school, back to the res, from town, and write out stories with a pen on a pad of paper. These little short stories that were, fictionalized versions of the things that I saw happening around me in my community, because I was inspired to do that by these books I read that my aunt gave me. And, I learned more about some of the other authors that were out there. And I had the dream then that I wanted to become a published author one day. And it took a while to get to that route because I got sidetracked by journalism, which is a whole other story that we can talk about later, which is a long story. But I just kept writing all the way through, my teen years and into my 20s. When I started working full-time in journalism, I always made time, in the evenings or on the weekends to write creatively, to make up these stories that I was interested in, that, I would maybe hope to publish one day. And I didn't know how to go about doing that. And that is another long process too that happened, but I was fortunate to get into the publishing world. But that became my sort of side passion, I guess. And now today is my main job. It's my primary gig, and I just feel so fortunate that I've come into this place in order to do that. So how that happened mostly was Moon of the Crested Snow, the book that some of you are familiar with already. That came out in 2018. It was my third work of fiction, as Jeanette mentioned, and it got some significant attention. And it opened up a lot of opportunities for me to do more fiction writing and to do more work related to literature. So that's why I left my job at CBC pretty much 2 years ago now. Around this time is when I gave them my notice that I was quitting. But the reason I did that was because there was just so many cool things on the horizon that I couldn't turn it down, And CBC was a great job. It was a great career, and it was kind of, a lot to walk away from. But I came into sort of a better, I think, career path as a result. And I feel so fortunate that this is what I'm able to do. So before I open it up to your questions, I'll just tell you a little bit about the origin of Moon of the Crested Snow, how it came together. And it really goes back to those high school years. I did mention that I read all these books that I enjoyed, but that were totally unrelated to me as an Indigenous person. Still, there was lots I learned from them, right? And I learned about fiction writing as a result. And I sort of absorbed what made good fiction, and I think was inspired to explore some of my own stories. And a lot of those books that I read in high school were those dystopian and post-apocalyptic ones. In grade 12, we had a lot of those books on our reading list. namely 1984, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451. And there were books in the earlier years too, that in the same vein that really piqued my interest in that sense, like Lord of the Flies by William Golding is a post-apocalyptic story. And also The Chrysalids, which I read in grade 9 by John Wyndham, is a sort of post-apocalyptic dystopian story as well. What I really liked about those books when I was younger was, of course, they look to the future, which is always fun to do. If you're an imaginative person, you like to envision what our future looks like, even if it is bad. But what I really appreciated the more was how you could use books like that to interpret our modern society and some of the things we're doing wrong that could lead us to that path, right? So in a way, like dystopian or post-apocalyptic novels are social commentary about what's happening right now. And I really enjoyed that. I thought, hey, like as someone who comes from an experience of already a world ending, I have another perspective of seeing how things have gone wrong. And how this is dystopia in some ways, real life now for a lot of people. So I thought, if I ever, become an author, I want to write a book like that someday. The biggest moment I got the wheels turning with that was the big blackout of August of 2003. So a lot of you probably weren't born by then, but most of your teachers probably were. What happened was there's this big power outage that impacted a big part of North America, like on the eastern part, impacting like tens of millions of people. I was home in Wissahickon the day it happened. I was living in Toronto working as a freelance journalist, but I was home that day visiting my brothers because we were house sitting for our dad and stepmom who were on summer holidays. So the power went out, and we thought it was kind of weird because it was a hot summer day, nice and sunny, clear skies. Power doesn't usually go out in weather like that, right? So we decided, okay, whatever, you just sort of brushed it off. But the afternoon went on, and the power still didn't come back on. We were bored mostly, like we couldn't watch TV or play video games. So we got in the car and we drove into Parry Sound, which is about a 5-minute drive away. And we went downtown and we saw all the lights were out and all the stores were closed. And we're like, oh, geez, power's out here too. So we saw some friends on the main street and we stopped and talked to them. And they said, yeah, we heard on the radio that this is this massive blackout, like power's out in Toronto, New York, Boston, Montreal, Cleveland, Ottawa, everywhere, power's out. And we got scared. We're like, oh, geez, this might be the big one. This might be the end, So we went back to the res and we started making plans. We, looked at all the food in the cupboards at our dad's place. We gathered firewood because, the electric stove was useless because we thought that's how we'd have to cook our food. We got all our fishing gear together because we thought we'd have to catch fish to eat and so on, right? But what was really comforting was we thought about all the people around us in the community who we could go to for help, or the people that we could help if they needed it, right? So there was this strong sense of community there that made it way less scary. And we had a plan, we knew what we were gonna do if the power was gone for good. And the next day rolled around and the power came back on and we forgot about our plan pretty much straight away and started playing video games again, right? But that really stuck with me regardless. And I went back to Toronto a couple days later to go back to work, and I learned from my roommates there. And just remember, this is the days before social media. So like, there's no way to get like the up-to-date info. So I went and talked to my roommates and they're like, oh yeah, like they were telling me about what happened there. And it wasn't like outright chaos, but there were some pretty chaotic things that were happening in the city. Like people were buying up all the food in the stores and there were long lineups at the gas stations and so on, right? So I thought, wow, if this ever happens again, I'm definitely leaving Toronto and going back to the res. I'm not sticking around here because I felt safe in my community, at the end of the world, which is what I thought was happening at that point. So I thought, this is something I definitely want to write about in the future. And it took a while before, I actually started, more conceptualizing Moon of the Crested Snow. But I read another post-apocalyptic book about 5 years after that called The Road by Carmack McCarthy. It's a post-apocalyptic story about a father and a son who are basically fleeing for safety. It's very dark, it's very violent. basically they're running away from cannibals who are trying to eat them, you know. So not necessarily late summer reading. I wouldn't put that on your summer reading list, but it's a good book regardless, right? And it really inspired me to write Moon of the Crested Snow. The main reason was it was only about these protagonists trying to get to safety, trying to escape. You know, they want to get to this destination. They don't know what they're going to find there, but there's no real thought about creating a community or looking to the future. And when I thought back to our experience with the blackout, that was all we were thinking about was, okay, we have our community here. We know what we can build for the future. And that was really comforting. And I thought, you know, I want to write about something like that. You know, if I write a post-apocalyptic or dystopian story, I definitely want to put an Anishinaabe lens on it. And that's what's going to, I guess, inform and really guide the story along the way. And that's one of the main things I tried to accomplish with Moon of the Crested Snow. So yeah, it came out 3.5 years ago now, and I'm working on the sequel, which will be out next year, next May. So that's as much as I want to share with you now. So feel free to ask me anything.
So just to mention, you know, if we want to ask questions, feel free. Teachers, if students have questions, you can type them in the chat, or you can just turn your mic on and ask them live if you like. It's completely up to you. We can work it either way.
Hi, Jeanette. One of my students has a question here, wants to know, Wab, if you got a chance to travel outside of the country when you were working as a journalist.
Oh, just to the States, you know, I've actually done more travel as an author. You know, when I worked in Ottawa, I would do some stories in New York there. But most of my work as a journalist was in Canada. I did, you know, a lot of stories from northern Manitoba, northern Ontario, and you know, but that was like my objective as a journalist too, was mostly to cover Indigenous stories. I was a general assignment reporter, so I covered everything. But when I had the choice, I really wanted to, you know, put the spotlight on Indigenous communities and Indigenous issues, right? So I honestly did not have that much of a desire to do international reporting because there are important stories I wanted to tell here at home, right? I think if I stayed as a journalist, I would have pursued more international, I guess, coverage or opportunities. But since I became a full-time author, I've done a lot more travel. I've been to Singapore. I'm going to France later this year. And yeah, the fiction seems to be taking me farther geographically than the journalism did. But yeah, I think that's just, you know, the opportunities that I've had, and I always try to make the most of them, right? And I don't take them for granted at all. Even when I was a journalist, you know, just the opportunity to talk to people and help them share their story is a big responsibility that I always really valued, you know, and I never took it for granted. So yeah, so more travel coming up for Moon of the Crested Snow. But yeah, that's one benefit of being able to be a professional storyteller, I guess.
Miigwech to Mishpah students. Thanks for the answer, Wab. While students are thinking of some questions and teachers are managing that, I'm sure on their end, I had a quick question actually about character development. So I did read Moon of the Crested Snow kind of when it came out, and then I was mentioning this morning, I sort of reread it last month, and I was thinking about the characters and wondering actually about your process as far as developing characters. Like, are you pulling influence from certain folks in your life, or just folks in society in general, or from your community? How do you sort of work and develop those character profiles? I'm thinking about Evan or Nicole, you know, just anything you have to say about that.
Yeah, great question. You know what? For me, that's the most important part of the process. You know, I think when you come up with a story idea, you know, the basic plot, that's of course the starting point, right? You know, like I thought, okay, for Moon of the Crested Snow, I was like, okay, I want to write a post-apocalyptic story about a Northern Ontario First Nation that's is dealing with this crisis and is visited by unwelcome people. You know, that's the point intention. That's the basic plot, right? And you know, I had this idea kicking around for years before that. So once that's sort of, you know, down on paper, once I've written that down, then I go to developing the characters before I do more of that sort of plotting and more of that sort of structural work. Because, you know, I believe when we read, what we connect with the most is the characters, obviously. And whatever the plot may be, if we can connect with them in really meaningful ways, then we're along for the ride no matter what. Like if a good character can take you just to Superstore for a shopping trip, if they're really well written, you know, and if you have that empathetic connection with them. And so I spend a lot of time dreaming up the characters, finding ways to make them as human as possible, because I want a reader to see not necessarily themselves, but to see some human elements in them that they can connect with, that they can relate with, right? So I spend like months, you know, thinking about what they look like, you know, how they behave, what their favorite food is, like all these details that you would think are mundane. But that's how you get to know the characters yourself, right? As a storyteller. And even though all of those details won't necessarily make it into the story, you know that about them in case one of those details is needed in the story, right? Like for Moon of the Crested Snow, for example, like there's that moment where Isaiah and Evan are in the truck and they start arguing about music. You know, like I needed something to humanize them and make them relatable because we've all had, you know, these little, you know, fun arguments with our friends about music. Like at the end of the world, you're still going to have these things happening, right? And that's going to connect you to each of those characters. So one of them likes heavy metal, the other likes country music, you know, and that's where they sort of have this friendly rivalry. So it's things like that to really consider. And in terms of real life inspiration, yeah, I think the main characters, what I do is take a bit from people in my life, you know, certain elements, certain traits that I admire. And they're more of like an amalgamation, you know, like more of like a Frankenstein, you know, like not one character is based on one person entirely. Because if you come from a small community like I do, that can be problematic, right? Like people are going to know who that character is, you know? And so what I do is, yeah, just take the good things in people that I, you know, admire and put them into the protagonists, you know, like Evan, he is like in his mid-20s. He has a firm understanding of living on the land. You know, he operates a snowplow. He knows how to hunt and everything. He has some cultural knowledge. You know, so these are all things that I admire in people around me, and I put them all into him, right? And he, you know, is more skilled than I am. He has knowledge that I don't have, and I aspire to be someone like Evan, even though he'd be like 20 years younger than me, right? But that's like what I saw growing up, people like him. And that's what I see around me still when I go to my home community, you know? So yeah, and when I'm, you know, mapping out these characters, I write these big, long character profiles, just in point form. But for someone like Evan, it'd be like 2 pages, and Nicole too. And then like I do the opposite for the antagonists, you know, for Justin Scott, I took everything that I don't like about bad people and I put them all into him, you know? And like for him, like physically, he's inspired by another Cormac McCarthy character, actually, the character of the judge in a novel called Blood Meridian. He has this mysterious background. He's this massive, imposing dude with a big bald head. And I would never, you know, sort of hint that I could write anywhere as good as Cormac McCarthy, but that's sort of where I drew that inspiration from, right? And yeah, so it comes from like real people, it comes from fictional people too. But getting back to what I was saying earlier, is for me, it's most important that I understand who each of these characters is before I actually write the story, you know. And then when you do that, that can help guide the plot if you get stuck at a certain point, you know. If you're like, oh, okay, they're at this sort of roadblock, maybe there's something in Isaiah's past that will help them get through this, right? So yeah, that also involves like writing backstories for them all too. So yeah, for me, it's a big involved process, but it's hugely helpful for the entire book, I find.
Okay, so I have a few questions in the chat here. What is the favorite story that you have written? Which is a question from a student in Miss Fott's class as well. So if you were to pick your absolute favorite, can you do that? Sometimes I feel like that might be like saying who's your favorite kid, you know? I always say it depends on the day.
You know what? I can't answer that. It would be Moon of the Crested Snow, and mostly because I had so much fun when I was writing that. Like my first two books, Midnight Sweat Lodge is a collection of short stories, and Legacy is a novel. But both of those, most of those stories are really, really intense. You know, they're both about dealing with trauma, and a lot of it that I wrote about is based on, you know, my family's experiences, our community's experiences. So I have this huge emotional connection to both of those books, and like I'm glad I wrote them. I'm glad that they're out there, but it's sometimes hard for me to revisit them because, you know, I wrote and I maybe not have been as emotionally aware of being a human, you know. But that was like my part of my healing process was exploring these things, exploring these traumas and tragedies that have occurred within my family and within my community, right? So the really emotionally heavy books, and for readers too, I think they're emotional too. And with Legacy, like I would like to write a revised version one day, because I'd always planned on writing a sequel to it. But I know that I won't have time for that now, and I don't necessarily know if I want to write a whole other story to it. So I might like write like an extended epilogue in a new version, just to sort of tie that all together. So all that's to say, I had less of an emotional connection to Moon of the Crested Snow, and therefore had more fun writing it. So in that way, it is my favorite story. Also because like it changed my career too, you know. So it opened up all kinds of doors for me, right? And it's fun for me to talk about. It's weird to say that like I had fun writing an end of the world story and I have fun talking about it all the time, but I honestly really do. So yeah, I'd have to say that's my favorite one.
Okay, so is there any plans to turn Moon of the Crusted Snow into a film or a Netflix series? That's a question from a student as well.
Well, there is hope. It's hard to say if it's going to happen. So a producer has the screen rights to it. His name is Robin Cass. He's based in Vancouver. He has not had much luck finding a home for it, but what we did was he hired another writer, a TV writer, and we all worked together to create this plan for like a 6-part series, which would be on hopefully Netflix or Crave or Prime or something, right? But you know, books get optioned for screen all the time and don't end up on the screen. And while I hope that would happen someday, I'm not putting all my eggs in that basket. What I'm more hopeful for is when the next book is out, that there'll be more interest and more of a possibility to do both of them together. But that would be in years to come. And the reason I think that is that, you know, even though I didn't plan to write a sequel, for me, it ties some things up a little more nicely, and it throws to the future in a more interesting way, I think, without giving too much away, right? So my hope is when the next book's out, we'll be able to do something bigger with both of those books.
Check. Oh. You talked about books inspiring and moving you to this this genre and where you went. So were there any movies that inspired your book?
Oh yeah. Oh geez. Well, with Moon of the Crested Snow, I'm just trying to think, like, if there are any particular movies that, any end of the world movies, like, you know, you think of the big blockbuster ones, like Independence Day, or, you know, like films like that. Like, of course they're cool, you know, and they're spectacular, literally. But yeah, I don't think a movie like that would have really inspired that book that much. There is a film adaptation of The Road, which is not as powerful as the book. You know, as they all say, the movie's never as good as the book, right? But I think with, you know, being a writer, I've always admired filmmaking, and there are some great films that I think inspired a lot of my earlier writing. There's a movie called Dance Me Outside, based on a novel, but it was filmed in Wasauksing and in Shawaniga First Nation, like back home. And it's like a revenge story, and it's similar in some ways to Legacy. And I think when I was writing that, I really drew inspiration from the film version, mostly because I could visualize things a little bit more. You know, I saw Indigenous people on the screen and I saw them behaving and so on. So yeah, I think a lot of books by Indigenous filmmakers, just about Indigenous realities, I think helped me write Indigenous characters a little better too. Not necessarily the plots, but like just seeing the characters out there is definitely helpful for sure.
Okay, I have another question from Miss McKay's student. Which book did you find the easiest to write? And then there's a second part to that question. Do you experience writer's block, and how does that work?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, my first book, Midnight Swellage, is the shortest, so maybe that was the easiest. It's just 4 short stories. And I wrote the earlier versions of those stories when I was a kid, you know, when I was a teenager, when I was all your age. And I revised them when I was in my 20s, and it became that collection, right? So it was a lot of hard work to revise them, but like the source material was already there. And I think because I was still relatively youngish, I felt the same way as I did when I was a teenager, you know, when I was revising them in my 20s. So in some ways, I guess that was the easiest. But, you know, the writing had to improve for sure, because, you know, as empowered, I think, as I was as a teen, you know, there were some things I had to fix and polish up to get it, you know, ready for publication. And I worked with a really good editor named Jordan Wheeler, who is a Cree author and TV writer, who was just great. You know, as a young writer, to be mentored by someone a bit older who had a lot of experience was really awesome for me. So he made it easier for me too. You know, it was my first experience in literature, but I had this guy with a lot of experience really taking me under his wing. So it was less scary. So in some ways, yeah, maybe that was the easiest one to write, just because of how it all came together. In terms of writer's block, oh yeah, I experience it all the time, like almost every day. And what's important to do is like have your process to get out of your writer's block. And the easiest thing to do is just step away, you know, like close the laptop, or, you know, get away from your desk. Go outside for a walk if you can, or go do something else, like wash the dishes or fold laundry or shovel snow. Go work out if you can, or play guitar, or even just like watch some funny videos on YouTube, or watch your favorite TV show. Just anything to totally get your mind off what you were doing. Because once you're done and you come back to it, you'll feel like, I guess, re-inspired in some ways. So it's just like detaching yourself from the story for a little bit, because I believe, like, if you start overthinking it, then you're going to start to dislike it. And the last thing you want to do is dislike your passion. You know, you want to love writing. And I believe, this is just my personal opinion, that if you keep forcing yourself to do it, you're not going to like it as much. So make sure you step away and do something else. And then when you come back, it'll all come together a little more clearly.
Excellent. Thank you. I see a question here. Can you tell us a little bit more about the publishing process? So what parts are frustrating? What parts are exciting? And how does that all work?
Oh, I think the most frustrating part is it's a long process. Like, it takes years for a book to come out. So you just really got to be patient. You have to, I think, understand that the industry in Canada especially is much slower than in somewhere like the United States or in Germany. And I think that's just due to the infrastructure. It's not that big of an industry in Canada. There aren't as many publishers compared to other countries. So yeah, things move very, very slowly. So like I'm used to it by now. Like the next book, like Moon of the Turning Leaves, it could be done by now and they could be publishing it by this summer, but it won't be out until next May because just how the industry works, like the publisher has to, make a marketing plan. They have to do all the design, and then they have to do a promotional plan for me, like set up like reading dates and a tour and things like that. So like if they really wanted to, they could get the book out shortly, but then there wouldn't be all the opportunities to market it, and they want to make money, right? It's an industry. It's about making cash. So, they want to put it out at the right time. The exciting part is being creative, like especially with this book I'm working on now. As I mentioned, I didn't plan on writing a sequel to Moon of the Crested Snow. So I had this opportunity presented to me and I was like, okay, I can dream up a whole part two. I can think about what happens next when I didn't originally plan to. And they're going to publish it. They're going to pay me to publish it, right? So of course, it's a lot of thought and a lot of work goes into that, but it's all so fun because you're just letting your imagination go. I am dreaming up the next part of these characters' lives, and people are going to be able to read that. It was just a little idea in my head, and eventually I'm going to be able to hold it in my hands. It's going to be a tangible thing. And that's the most exciting part of it all, just like literally the fruits of your labor, right? So, yeah. So yeah, it's a big, long process, but it's all totally worth
it. Thank you. And that does sound exciting. I can imagine that first meeting you get to hold it. That's like pretty cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a student question. What is one tip you would give someone who's actually wanting to pursue journalism as opposed to?
Great question. I would say stay curious, question everything around you, have wonders about the world around you. I think with journalism, we think of it too much as just like the stories that are out there and the issues that are happening. And a lot of it is bad news, obviously. A lot of it is really troubling events happening in the world and in our communities and so on. But what stems from, I think, good human-based journalism is curiosity. So if you're interested in someone else's story, or if you're interested in finding out why something happened or why things are the way they are, then I think you're well on your way to becoming a journalist. The practices, the technologies, the writing, I think all those things are pretty straightforward to learn, and I think anybody can do it. And you don't need to go to university to be a journalist. You can go to college to be a journalist. You can, study something else and then have like an internship, or even like through high school, whatever co-ops you do. It doesn't take long to learn the tricks of the trade, really, because it's just, again, about being curious, asking questions, and then being able to present the information that you find in an effective way. So you can do that for a newspaper, for online, for TV, for radio. But again, it goes back to what I was saying about, striking a chord with other humans, because you want people to care about the people you're reporting on, and that's your job. You're the middle person, essentially. Like, you're the conduit to helping other people learn about other people, which is a really cool thing if you think about it that way. So just having that mentality, I think, is the best place to start. And then just understanding all the technologies that go into it nowadays. Like, and I think young people, especially people in their teens and in their 20s, are, I think, more prone and more adept to learning these trades because they're online more. One thing I always say, like, I'm not on TikTok, but my wife is, and she'll show me like the funny videos here and there. But what really impresses me about TikTok is I'll see a young person tell a story in 1 minute or 2 minutes. very concisely, tell all the details, tell, how it made them feel or how it made somebody else feel, and wrap everything up. And that's basically what broadcasting is. When I worked in TV and in radio, we had to do stories in 1 minute or 2 minutes, and that was basically it. And I see young people doing that on TikTok every day just for fun. So I remind people, like, you're doing it. You're basically being a broadcaster, right? You know the tools. So it's just, the more human element is something that I think that has to be fostered, I think, more effectively. But the writing, the editing, the shooting, everything comes pretty smoothly, I think. So just, so I would say, be curious and know how to use the tools, and you'll be well on your way.
Fletch. I just want to make sure I didn't miss any questions in here. Nope. I do have a question because you mentioned the day school in your community, Ryerson Day School, and then we know that you went to Ryerson for journalism, and I actually ran across an article, and these are your words. I'm just going to quote you because I read it and I was, wow, okay, this is amazing. So you talked about a little bit in the article about being at Ryerson and kind of finding a little community of Indigenous students, being at, and we can talk about the history of Ryerson a little bit, but I think, we know. So we were united in our resolve. You're talking about this group of students, you and this group of students. We were united in our resolve to succeed despite him and his racist efforts. And we knew that succeeding at a university named after a man who would have never wanted us there in the first place would be the ultimate educational triumph. So I read that and I thought it was amazing because I think even when you mentioned, when you were in high school, when I was in high school, we didn't have access to Indigenous voices. We didn't see that in our mainstream. And we're working hard. Are we, perfect? Absolutely not. But we're working really hard to bring this to the table and to have that thought as you are in a school named after the architect of residential schools, essentially. Can you just kind of talk about just that experience and how sometimes we can use this as it seems like you guys kind of had this little group and you use it kind of almost like as a motivator.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, it's so interesting because everybody that I met, and I went there in 1998. That was my first year of school, 24 years ago. But there was not that awareness at all, more widespread, of Ryerson and his history. But we all knew, all us Indigenous students, just because that's part of our community history and our shared history too. So everybody I met, we were all like, yeah, we're here, and yeah, we know, but we're gonna do our best. And because for that reason, he wouldn't have wanted us there in the first place, So getting our degree, even though like I don't agree with using the name at all, it's like, okay, that is something that I think is the antithesis of what his vision for the future of Canada would have been. He wouldn't have wanted Indigenous people at universities at all. So in that way, like that's what we took comfort in. And there's one friend from those days. His name's Travis Busno. He's from Garden River First Nation, and he's one of the deputy Grand Chiefs within the Anishinaabe Nation now. And we had those talks all the time. And we're like, well, we're here doing it. We may as well do our best because we're the ones prevailing. We're the ones who will get to properly write the history books once we're done here. And I think that was a pretty long view for us to have back then, 20 years ago. But fortunately, it worked out that way. And that was due to, I think, our perseverance and our spirit of community, really. Like we knew we wouldn't be able to do that on our own. But with the support of each other, we would each get our degrees and we'd each try to succeed in our fields. And our presence in our respective fields would change the attitudes of other Canadians and shine a light on what the true history of this land really is. And as a result, the Ryerson statue got pulled down last summer, and in that piece, I express, my various opinions around everything around that. But Yeah, just being a part of that history is really cool, and I think now it takes some really tragic things to bring the truth to light, but Canadians are finally understanding, and I just think about my own kids and the world that they're growing up in and how it's totally different than my own childhood in terms of that awareness and in terms of that inclusivity and acceptance and so on. And it's easy to be discouraged about the state of our world, about the state of our country, but I always look back to my own childhood and consider how much things have changed in a good way. And kids growing up nowadays will have a better future, than the reality I had as a kid too. So can't help but be optimistic when you think about your own life's experience that way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, I had a question too in regards to, and we kind of joked about this a little bit this morning, talking about, you released Moon of the Crested Snow in 2018, and all of a sudden, late 2019, 2020, global pandemic, right? So it's a little wild, when we think about that and that connection. So did you have those moments of, wow, okay. This is coming too. And you just mentioned earlier, so we're looking at it that way, and you wrote this story really from your own lens, which is so exciting when you're telling us that you're going to Singapore and you're sharing the story about this northern community in Ontario, and you're going to Singapore and France and sharing these your book. That's really cool. But when we're looking at it from the global pandemic hit, this story that is almost like, fortune telling, you know what I mean? Does he have a gift? But what's the, you started the story and then this has happened. What's the social commentary you kind of you put out there as far as for our youth? What's the message that you want to leave us, because there is hope.
Mm-hmm.
We know that, but what's that the social commentary you want to sort of leave with us?
Oh, well, thanks for asking. I would say the main, I think, premise of the story is to understand and respect the land around you and your relationship with it, because all these things that we rely on, they're all temporary. They could all disappear very easily. They're very fragile. Whether that's electricity or communications technology or fossil fuels or whatever else, we could wake up one day and these systems will start to collapse. When they all do, hopefully they don't, but when they all do, we have everything we need in the land around us. And that's what the point of Moon of the Crested Snow is supposed to be. When everything falls away, and this is not just related to Indigenous nations here on this continent. Every society, every civilization around the world has land-based history, land-based teachings. Every society has agrarian knowledge or has had hunting and fishing expertise. Every society has known how to survive thanks to the land that it coexists with, right? And that's something we've forgotten as humans, absolutely, over the past 150 years, with the advent of technology and industry and so on. So when everything falls apart, when everything's stripped away, the ones who survive are the ones who know how to live that way, right? And of course, it's hard to figure out what we need to know and the skills we need to have. But I think working together as a community can teach each other the right way to do that, And we learned in the pandemic that we're not as close to the food that we eat at all as we imagined, In Sudbury, we're reliant on trucks coming in from elsewhere to stock our grocery shelves. And when those trucks can't come in anymore, what are we all gonna do, So not to be too fatalistic about it, but we do need to consider those things, right? And if those trucks can't come in, then there are a lot of deer just outside of the city limits. And if you don't eat meat, there's a lot of food you can harvest otherwise, So yeah, it's just about respecting the land and understanding we all come from it, regardless of who we are. And we need to foster a good relationship with the land as well. And that's what I hope a takeaway can be from the book.
Which, I think it looks like there's no other questions, and we're just about out of time, so that's worked out really well. But I just wanted to say, so Moon of the Turning Leaves, you mentioned 2023.
Yeah, May of 2023. That's what it looks like right
2023.
now.
So we'll be looking for that, and be anxious to find out what happens to our characters in this sequel. And very exciting if it does get picked up as a series or something like that. So our eyes and ears will be looking for that. But we just want to say, I just have some thank yous in the chat here, but miigwech to you, Rob, for just sharing your time with us and being so generous with your story, really, at the end of the day, and sharing with youth. It's really awesome to have this opportunity. And we know, I mentioned before, we're coming out of it now, I think, but having the opportunity to get proficient with technology has really allowed us this opportunity to have this larger platform. Of course, gathering live at some point would be a great gift, and we hope that maybe when the new book launches that we can have an actual visit. So that would be awesome. So miigwech so much for being with us. We have some thank yous in here. Miigwech again, and we really enjoyed it. Miigwech, that was all very inspirational, and we like your shirt. Cool shirt.
That's right.
So Baba P, and we hope to see you again.
Okay, miigwech everybody. Have a good day. Have a good rest of the school year. Happy spring, and yeah, hopefully next year we can do it in person when the next book's out. Baba P, take care.